And hello again, and here we are back in my garage. And today I want to make a video about how to rebuild a spoked wheel, how to lace it and how to screw it up. And the wheel I'm going to use is the rear wheel from my Kawasaki Z650B project bike. So I wasn't happy with it, it was too rusty and dented. So the first step is to cut out the spokes from that wheel and release the rim from the hub. And so now that the hub is separate from the rim, I cleaned up the hub, it's this one here, and I got it ready to be rebuilt. By the way, this hub is a drum rear brake, but the process of rebuilding a spoke wheel is no different whether it's a drum brake or a disc brake. Meanwhile, here is the rim I removed from the wheel. As you can see, it's pretty rusty, it's seen better days. It's also chrome steel, it's quite heavy. So I decided to replace these rims with some lightweight alloy rims from Italy. However, before I begin to relace the wheel, there are a few facts I want to go through before we begin. And so here we have the old rim. Put some tape on here to make it easier to write on. And the first thing I want to talk about is what I call the rule of 4. And the rule of 4 means that the spokes around the rim repeat themselves in a pattern of 4. It doesn't matter where you start, you always get a repeating pattern of 4 all the way around the rim. And that's why the vast majority of wheels have either 36 or 40 or 32 spokes, because it's all a multiple of 4. So randomly then, I'll just start here. I'll put a 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we start again, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is the 1 and the 1 here are both similar spokes. They both go in the same direction back to the hub and on the same side. So of these 4 spokes here, 2 go to the left hand side of the hub and 2 go to the right hand side of the hub. And for each pair of spokes on the right hand side and the left hand side, they are angled in different directions. One of the pair goes this way and one of the pair goes this way, and that's the same on both the left and the right of the wheel. And to help you know which spoke goes where, handily the holes punched in the rim are angled. So some go to the left hand side, some go to the right hand side, and some go this way and some go that way, which is great because it tells you where your spoke needs to go. So this one here, for example, this is going this way to the far side of the rim. This one's coming towards me on this side. This one's going that way to the far side of the rim, and so on and so on. And you'll find from here to here, these two are the same. They're angled the same way, going to the same side. So I guess, as I say, it's just a repeating pattern of 4. Doesn't matter where you start. I could start there, I could start there. Doesn't matter. It's a pattern that repeats all the way around the rim. And so that's the rule of 4, and it covers the vast majority of spoke wheels you're ever likely to meet. But, and of course, there's also but, there are a few wheels on modern bikes that don't perhaps follow that rule. And I'm thinking in particular of BMW GS's, because they have tubeless tyres and the spokes don't go to the centre of the rim, they go to the outside of the rim. I've never rebuilt one, but I'm told they are an absolute PITA to relace. And I know there are some experienced wheel builders out there who just refuse to rebuild those BMW wheels. So I've never rebuilt one before, so I've no idea what the issue is, but if you're ever likely to meet one, then be very cautious about what you're doing. But moving on then, the next thing I want to talk about is the spokes. And so when it comes to spokes, you can either buy the spokes and nipple separately, or you can buy them combined. If you buy them combined, it's called a spoke set, and that's what I tend to buy. So here's a photograph of the wheel and spoke set of the front wheel that I've just been rebuilding. And you might notice from the photograph I've got the spokes separated into 2 groups, and that's because all the spokes aren't the same. No, there are 2 different kinds of spokes. And so it's time for a no expense spared diagram. And the two different mechanical spokes you'll find are different at the curved end where they go into the hub. And what I've got is here, you've got a spoke like that. That's a sort of nipple right on the end there where it goes into the hub. But then you get another kind which are a little bit longer. It's only a very small difference, but this bit here is a bit longer than this one and a bit more curved. I call these spokes the inners and the outers. You can call it whatever you like, the A and the B, the X and the Y, but I call them the inners and the outers. So, why is that important? Well, you've got to make sure you lace the inners in the correct hole and the outers in the correct hole of the hub. Otherwise, you can't lace the wheel. So, with that explained then, why do we have what I call the inners and the outers? And in fact, there are two reasons why you need to have two different types of hub. Now in my case, my hub here on my Kawasaki is a slightly easier option because the spokes are laced in opposite directions around the hub. Basically, one spoke goes this way and then goes up to the rim. The next one goes this way and then turns up to the rim, and so on all the way around the hub. I'll show you a photograph now. And that shows you the way the spokes alternate from going in and going out around the hub. So if we now have a look at the hub itself and the flange where the holes are drilled for the spokes to go through, you'll notice that the inside of the flange is flat, whereas the outside of the flange is angled. This means that those spokes that go this way and then turn up to the rim, they have a sort of straighter shot up to the rim, whereas the spokes which go this way, which I call the outers, they have to be angled up, and they have to be kind of angled a bit more acutely because they've got to lean in a bit more, and therefore let me put this down because it's quite heavy, and therefore if I grab my diagram here, and therefore that's the inner with a sort of straight shot to the rim. And this is the outer because it's got to curve more acutely to get back to the rim, because this is on the outside. If you get them mixed up, you can't rebuild your wheel, you can't relace the wheel. You'll find these outers just don't meet the rim. That's really important, don't get them mixed up. I call them inners and outers, you can call them whatever you like, but I call them inners and outers. So I did say there's a second reason why you need to have inners and outers, and that second reason is because there are some hubs and wheels out there where the spokes are all threaded through the hub in the same direction. I'm thinking in particular of Harley Davidson. I happen to own a bike with Harley hubs, so here's a photograph of that hub. And as you can see, they're all pointing in the same direction. They're all sort of like, where are we? They're all, let me think, they're all kind of going from like that, going up to the rim. They're all the same. However, that gives you a problem because close to the hub, the spokes have to cross over. Look at any hub, any wheel, any spoke wheel, you'll notice the spokes cross over each other close to the hub. So let's see if I can draw that. So there's a spoke from the hub, and there's a spoke from the hub, and there's the rim, and they cross over really close to the hub. The problem is the spoke has to pass over the back of this spoke here, and to do so, well, it's got to have a longer tail here. This has got to be a bit longer. They don't have to be as curved because they're all going in the same direction, so rather than being a bit more curved, what you get is a inner looking like that and an outer looking like that. So the same curve but slightly longer. It's not a big difference, it's only a few millimeters, but you've got to make sure you use the correct spoke in the correct hole. So yeah, that's something I found a lot with Harleys. They all seem to want to lace the wheels in the same direction. I guess because it looks better. Most Japanese bikes don't do that. They have alternate holes, which actually makes lacing up the wheel a bit easier, but we'll come to that later on. And so we've now got the hub, the spokes, the nipples and the rim, and we understand how those spokes are going to be laced to the wheel. However, just one more little tool I still need, which is this, and this is a spoke key. It's very cheap. I think it cost me about £3 this thing did, and it's just a little small spanner which happens to fit the standard sizes of spokes, spoke nipples rather. So on here I've got an 8 and a 6 mil and 8 mil. It's also, as you see, quite small. It's much smaller than a standard spanner would be, and that's because you don't want to be over tightening your nipples on the spokes. It's very tempting to do, but no, you mustn't do that, and that's why it's quite small. If it was longer, you'd be tempted to put a bit more torque on the nipples. They're not massively strong, they don't have massively big, deep threads, and it's very easy to over tighten them and strip the thread, which you don't want to do. But we'll come back to that when we get to truing up the wheel. And so let's begin. Here we have the hub, the rim, and I've got a packet of the spokes and the nipples. So the first thing to do is to separate the spokes into two types. Oops. We've got the inners and we've got the outers. As you know, the inners have a shorter tail end, little curve there, they're the inners, and we'll find an outer, no doubt. That one there. So here we have, let me just put that in. Here we have an outer and an inner. You can see that? This is tail's a bit longer and a more of a cute curve. So let's separate those and then we can begin. And so we'll start off with one inner spoke. So these go from the outside in. I'll just pick a random hole in the hub. There we go. Now you have to push it all the way through to make it swivel up to meet the rim, and that's important, so we'll come to that later on. So now, 1 in every 4 of these holes will suit this particular spoke. I want a hole that is angled this way up towards this side of the hub, and one that's actually angled this way as well. So let's just find one, and I think, let me see, that one there might do the job, like that. By the way, it's often helpful if you can have the rim raised up a little bit from the floor. I mean, this is actually a bit too high, but so it's sort of central to the hub, because the hub's obviously a bit wider than the rim. So once I've done that, by the way, there's a bird you can hear from the chimney next to me. He's up on the roof. So I'm just going to put a nipple on the end of there, like that. There it goes. Now don't tighten up the nipples too much, just leave them really loose for the time being. And so now we're going to repeat that process for the same kind of spoke. As I say, you've got to lift it up like that. Again, I've got to count 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then that one goes in there, like that. I'll get a nipple, push them through like that, and then just spin it on just a few turns, like I'm doing now. Keep everything nice and loose for the time being, and we'll just carry on. So I'll skip one and then go here. Obviously I do alternate ones because these other holes have spokes going that way, so I'm not doing those yet. Those are what I call the outers, because on this particular wheel those spokes go from the inside out, so we will do that later on. And so now we just have to repeat the process for all these spokes. There's, let's see, 10 altogether. So I'll just go all the way around and get these first 10 spokes on the rim. And now, as you can see, I've laced up all 10 of those spokes very loosely to the rim, and I've also turned over the wheel. Now, it would be very tempting to try and lace up the rest of the spokes on that side. Those are the outer spokes, these here with the longer tail, which go from the inside out. But I've not done that because it can cause you a big problem later on in the build, in the wheel build. So I wanted to show you what that problem might be. Some wheels you don't have a problem, and some wheels are a nightmare. And the way I'm doing this right now won't work, depending on the particular wheel. Now luckily I'm using a back wheel which is quite wide, and the spokes are quite short, and this particular wheel I have spokes going this way and also from the inside out, all of which helps me with the lacing, but sometimes it's not so simple. So I'm going to carry on with this method, but I expect near the end I might have a problem, but we'll just have to wait and see. I'll just lace them all up right now. So we skip a one and go here, Turn it in. Yeah, I think this might work. Now the big problem you have with this particular method is that, particularly where the spokes all go in the same way, like I'm doing now, you'll get to the last few spokes and you'll find you won't be able to fit them to the wheel. Let me just stop that from... It does get very fiddly. This is why I don't like this particular method, but let's just get that out of the way. Because the spokes that you've already laced to the wheel get in the way. They get in the way of you doing this, of you just pushing it through and turning the spoke like this up to the rim. If you imagine all the spokes were now laced up on the other side, they will interfere with me trying to lace up these new spokes, particularly ones which go from the outside in. The ones that go from the inside out aren't a problem because they've got plenty of room, but these can be a right nightmare, particularly with Harley wheels and front wheels in particular, because front wheels, the spokes are much longer and the hub is much narrower. But so far I think we're doing okay. So I'm just placing them all roughly where they need to be. If this works, then I'm fine. The rest of the lacing will go really easily, because the other spokes, the outers, they go from the inside out, so I can spin them up no problem. But I wanted to demonstrate this process because it can be a bit of a nightmare. But so far, so good. All is going well, which is great, but it's not always the case. And when it's not going well, what you end up doing is starting again. You have to remove all your spokes and start again. And then what happens is, right, okay, so they're all roughly now where they need to be. And the problem is that if you lace up some of the spokes first, you'll find the last few won't fit into the rim because the spokes you've already fitted get in the way. They prevent the spoke from coming through and then angling up. They hit the other spokes. So the answer to that problem is you undo all the nipples from the rim, and then you have to lace all of the spokes through the hub first before you attach any spokes to the rim, and then you have to, this is where you need about 4 pairs of hands. You need to take them all and have them all curved up so they're in line with the rim, just like I've done here. Once you've done that, you'll have lots of spokes going everywhere and no idea where they all go. But obviously just remember your rule of 4, and then you can start off and start attaching the spokes to the rim one by one. But don't forget, you've now got 40 spokes now all around here, all fanned out kind of randomly, so it makes life an awful lot more complicated. But it's the only way of doing it, and it's the only way of doing lacing of, say, Harley wheels where all of the spokes go from the outside in. The good news is this has now worked okay, and with the outers, these with the longer tail, they're not a problem because they go from the inside out, and so when they turn in, there's nothing in the way. There's no spoke stopping you from doing it, so that's great. So now I've just got to find my appropriate hole. That one goes there, like that. I'll get my nipple, back here, and attach it loosely. Everything's loose for the time being because you need all the help you can get when you try to attach these things. You don't want to get too tight, otherwise you'll be scratching the rim as you try and get a spoke into a particular hole. So that one has to go in there like that, and that one has to go 1, 2, 3, 4 in that one there, and so on and so on. So let me do that, and then we'll do the outers next. And now I've laced all the spokes on this side of the wheel, so I'm going to very gently turn it over. It's very loose at the moment, or loosey-goosey, that's fine. Makes life a bit easier to lace the last few spokes. So now I've got to lace these last few outers, and they simply go from the inside out, as it were, like that, and then I can find a home for them just like that. And so I'll continue when I finish lacing up these last few outer spokes. And now finally, we've got the wheel laced up. As you can see, it's all very loose at the moment, and that's fine, because now we're going to move on to the mysterious art of truing up this wheel. And so now I've got the wheel in my wheel stand, and the wheel stand is simply something that allows you to clamp the wheel nice and steadily, but also lets you spin it like this. And also it has, in my case, 2 of these rods which can be moved around, and they are just there to, hang on, spin it around a bit, they are just there to give you a visual aid to help you see how far out your wheel rim is from being true. So all you do is you move it, something like that. Actually, it's a bit loose now, and you can watch the wheel rim move around against this fixed point as it spins round, and that gives you a guide to how far out the wheel rim is. Now don't panic if you don't have a wheel stand, and of course why would you have? You can simply put this wheel back into your bike, back into forks, and away you go. You can do the same thing. Or you can remove the spindle from the forks and clamp it in a vise, and then attach, of course, the wheel to the spindle, and you can spin it up. Right, so with that explained, let's make a start. And so I've now spent about 20 minutes working on this particular wheel, and I've started off by tightening up every single nipple on the wheel to take out any rattle and give some tension to every single spoke on the wheel. Then I spent about 10 minutes just making a start on truing up the rim. So I'm watching these 2 fixed points here, and as I spin the wheel, you can see the rim moving against those 2 fixed points. What I'm trying to get to a point where there's no movement at all between the fixed point and the rim as it passes those fixed points. So how on earth do we do that? Well, it's actually quite simple. Or rather, it's simple in theory, but not so simple in practice. So what's the theory then? Well, the theory is that all I can do is tighten up the nipples one by one with my spoke key. So if I have a wobble in my rim, let me just find one, like there. So if I spin it back in 2, you can see, hopefully see that the gap closes between my fixed point and the edge of the rim, round about here. And that means that the wheel is wobbling to my left or your right. So to fix that problem, what I've got to do is tighten up the spokes on the opposite side, on this side here, on my right side. Because by making this a bit tighter, perhaps just 4 or 5 spokes in this area, then I'll move the rim to the right. And of course, the opposite applies. If the wobble goes to the left, I'll go to the opposite side and tighten up a few spokes on the left, on my left anyway. So that's how you get rid of the wobble from side to side. However, you can also get a wobble up and down, and that occurs because the rim is no longer concentric with the hub, or in fact it never was. So as it spins around, you'll see a point where perhaps the rim is rising up and falling. So in that case, where you see a rim rising up, you find a peak. In fact, this one's not bad actually, it's not too bad at all, but let's say it was there. What I've got to do then is I've got to tighten the spokes on both sides of the wheel. So tighten it on both sides, maybe 4 or 5 spokes on this side, 4 or 5 spokes on that side. What that will do is it will tighten the spokes on both sides, of course, and bring the hub closer to the top of the rim, and that will of course remove the high point. But also, and where life gets a bit more complicated, when you tighten up those spokes on the top here to get rid of that high point, you're also moving the hub closer to this part of the rim, but that means you are lengthening the gap between the bottom of the rim here and the opposite side of the hub. So these spokes on the opposite side get tighter. Even though you've not tightened them up, even though you've not tightened up any nipples, those spokes are going to be in more tension. And that's okay because, you know, the spokes are very strong and they can take an awful lot of tension. And that's all you do. So as I'm working now, I can see, for example, that round about there, I'm just working out roughly where the middle of the problem is, round about there, then that's where the gap is biggest between the edge of the rim and my fixed point. And that means I need to move the rim this way to get rid of that gap. So all I've got to do is take my trusty spoke key, mark where the problem is, which is about there, and start to tighten it up like this, clockwise of course. So I have read that some manufacturers, their tolerances are up to 2 millimeters movement at the rim edge, which seems a bit much to me, but I guess manufacturing processes get better over time, and modern wheels are probably a bit better than that. However, if you get down to less than 1 millimeter, that's pretty good, because once you've mounted the tyre on the rim, the chances are the tyre is not actually perfectly circular and perfectly moulded just right. So the tyre itself could be 0.5 mil out or 1 millimetre out side to side. So there's no point trying to go for 0.0 mil on the rim, because the tyre won't be that good. So I try to go for, as I say, 0.5 mil movement on the rim. Right, so while I continue to work on this wheel, I am getting there slowly. We're getting to the last sort of 10 minutes or so of work. There are a couple of things I want to add. First of all, I build these wheels dry. I don't use any lubricant on the threads of the nipples. I know some people say you should, but the guy who taught me how to build these wheels said never use any lubrication, always build them dry, so that's what I do. Secondly, if when you finish building the wheel, you need to check every single nipple inside the rim here to make sure none of the spokes poke up from the surface of the top of the nipple, because if they do, it can cause a puncture to your inner tube. And sure enough, I've got one here, I can feel it. This one here is poking up. So when I finish building the wheel, I've got to grind that down flat with the surface, the top surface of the nipple. I'll do that with a Dremel, a grinding wheel, little grinding wheel, but of course you can do it with a hand file maybe, although that will take quite a long time. But that's important to do, because otherwise, as I say, you're going to cause yourself a puncture, as that little spoke there poking up will slowly work its way through the rim tape into your inner tube, which is not ideal. So yeah, there's another point to make. So now I'll just keep on checking I've got a slight problem right there. Got a slight wobble, not very much now, only maybe a mil or two, but we need to get it right. You can now tell by the way, as I tighten these nipples to the point where they're correct, they start to creak and crack, and that's because obviously they're getting tighter. And it's just a question of experience, I guess, and practice to know how tight they need to be. The only thing I would add is that they're pretty tighter than you think they should be. You've got to get them pretty damn tight. And I can't really help you with that, because it's all down to practice and experience. Anyway, that said then, let me carry on, and hopefully, in 10 or so minutes, we should have this wheel sorted out. You can see I'm only making very small changes now, very small amounts of movement, because you don't want to go too far. Okay, get in there. Still not quite right. It's right around the blooming hole for the valve as well. But we just keep on doing that and we'll get there. And so as you can see, I've now moved on to truing up the front wheel, having completed the rear. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier on was that I always start by trying to take out any deviation in the vertical axis, any high points or low points. That's what I work on first before I start worrying about the wobble from side to side. I think that always is much easier to work with. So in this particular case, on this particular wheel, I've got half the wheel is too high and half the wheel is too low. I've got a high point right about there and a low point on the opposite side. So of course I grab my trusty spoke key and I tighten up the spokes around the area on both sides of the high point. But then I hit a problem. And the problem was I still had a bit of a high point here, and yet the spokes were getting awfully tight. I'm getting to the point where I don't want to tighten up the nipples anymore. So what to do? Well, what I can do, and what I did do, was I span the wheel around 180 degrees and I loosened off some spokes on the opposite side. And that has the same effect as tightening up the spokes where I've got the high point. So you might think, oh yes, we can do that, but then the spokes are too loose on the opposite side, which they are. But then, luckily, as I continue to tighten up the spokes on this side, suddenly they get a bit easier to turn, because obviously the stress and the tension's been removed slightly from this area of the wheel. So then I can carry on and tighten up the spokes on the high point until I get the rim running true. And luckily, as I do so, the effect of shortening these top spokes has the same effect on the bottom side here, where I'm lengthening these spokes here, which in turn adds tension to those spokes and makes them tighter. So where I've loosened off some spokes here to fix a problem, a high point at the top of the wheel, because I've now tightened up these spokes, the spokes here have also gone tighter as they're being stretched. So it kind of fixes the problem itself. So I'm now at the point where I've got the wheel running fairly true. If I just put that on there, let me find a high point. So there's the high point I had, and you can hear it's pretty much touching all the way around. It wasn't doing that before, it was way off on the low point. So now if I spin it up, I've still got a slight wobble side to side, which I'm now going to address very carefully, and I'm going to be making very small movements, just maybe an eighth of a turn or even less on each of the nipples to try and get the wheel spot on. And once I've done that, of course, my work's still not finished, because I've got to then take these wheels outside, get my Dremel and remove any protruding spokes that are protruding up from the surface of the nipples inside the rim. Otherwise, of course, it can cause a puncture. So let me finish this, and then we'll get the nipples ground off, and then hopefully these wheels are finished. And so now we're outside, because I finished truing up this wheel, and now it's time for me to get my Dremel out and grind off any protruding spokes on the rim. And actually there's quite a few of them. So I'm going to put this microphone down like that. Start off. I've got a grinding wheel on this thing, so let's find one. Let's get started. Right, one done, about 20 more to go. And so with the spokes ground down, that's the work finished on the wheel. So I can go off to get a new inner tube and a new tyre fitted. But I've got one last job to do, which is to fit this. And this is the rim tape. It's made for 18 to 19 inch wheels. It's quite stretchy, so all I've got to do is find the hole for the valve, which is somewhere around about here. There's a hole in it there, look. You line it up, and then you just stretch it around like this. It's just a great big rubber band, just helps to protect the inner tube from any sort of problems. Right, so there you go, that's now done, and this wheel and the front wheel are now ready to go off for, as I say, the new tyre and inner tube. So that's about it then for this particular video. It's quite a long video, but I did try and get as much information as I could about rebuilding wheels. So that's it. So thanks for watching, and cheers.